Hey everyone, welcome to the 15th series of Singularities. We're jumping out of the linear sequence a little bit. The last chapter we covered was the ninth series of the problematic, because in that series, Deleuze talked about some of the characteristics of singularities. One of them being that they're an inflection point, or they can be an inflection point. So we're using that inflection point to jump to series 15. In this chapter, Deleuze establishes his transcendental field, or what's behind it all, what causes things to come into existence. The subject is a little bit about morphogenesis. For instance, Plato's transcendental field was that of the ideal form, and Deleuze is using singularities to replace that. He describes these singularities as pre-individual, impersonal, and nomadic. So meaning that this is before any sense of self. It's before consciousness. It's before any notion of God. And by nomadic, he means that they're constantly in motion. It's the constant movement. It's important to realize that Deleuze uses the terms singularities, sense, and events almost simultaneously. So these singularities are little events in themselves. And he makes the point that this transcendental field is not an undifferentiated depth. It's not a giant abyss. It's populated by these singularities, and he'll describe the characteristics of how these singularities create things or have things come into existence. And along the way, he'll criticize phenomenology, Husserl, his attempt at a transcendental field, and also Immanuel Kant. And these criticisms are pretty good to read because they describe it pretty good. He'll describe what's going on in phenomenology and in Kant, and then he'll say, well, what's not right about it, or why they are unsatisfactory to him. He'll also criticize Sartre and his attempt to establish a transcendental field. And then this is again part of his project of replacing Platonic essences with events. And so the first person that he uses to back up his point, it's poetic rather than philosophical. He'll use the poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the beat poet, and his, not really a concept, but what he called the fourth person singular. So Ferlinghetti's notion of fourth person singular comes from his poem To the Oracle of Delphi. And I'll provide a link of actually Ferlinghetti reading that poem. It's a very short 2.5 minute thing. So it's kind of a way of talking about free indirect speech. And it's interesting to me that Deleuze uses a mystical concept. This is all in the poem. It's talking about the Oracle of Delphi and sort of its relation to America. And also digging a little bit into Ferlinghetti, because this is someone Deleuze is using as a reference point. I found this paper, which I thought very interesting. And I'll just quote from it. It was by someone named L.I. Ianni, if I'm pronouncing that right, Ianni. And she writes, Lawrence Ferlinghetti's novel, Her, as well as a number of his poems and plays, is permeated by one dominant precept, that love is the prime value that gives meaning to human existence. At the end of this chapter, Deleuze will use Nietzsche to back up this point, but saying after Nietzsche freed himself from Schopenhauer. So there's a little criticism of Schopenhauer in there. And he'll say that Nietzsche called this transcendental field the Dionysian will to power. This transcendental field being not an undifferentiated abyss, it leaps from one singularity to another, casting the dice each time. So he throws in chance and chance operations into his transcendental field. And also, as earlier, like I said, that sense and events and singularities are used synonymously. So he'll say that sense is replacing the Platonic essences as well as events. And at the end of the chapter, he'll say that Nietzsche made the groundless speak. He made this transcendental field speak, but it was almost too much for him. And he'll connect Nietzsche's later insanity that as sort of falling into this depth of not being able to remain on the fragile surface. Of course, combined with his corporeal condition as a result of syphilis. So Deleuze will say that there are 5 principal characteristics presented in the earlier series of this transcendental field. The first one is singularities / events form series. He elaborates on each of these points. So he talks about how singularities cause things to come into being, come into existence. The second characteristic is that these singularities possess a process of auto-unification. And he ties that again in with chance. The third characteristic is that these singularities or sense or these events haunt the surface. And he'll bring in a French philosopher named Gilbert Simondon, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And there's a great quote regarding that, which is that the living lives at the limit of itself, on its limit. The entire content of internal space is topologically in contact with the content of external space at the limits of the living. So this is kind of, if we look at ourselves, and Deleuze will even use the example of the skin of the body as something that's in contact with the inner parts of our bodies and also the outer parts. And another interesting thing regarding this point of sense haunting the surface is that he writes, an organism does not cease to contract in an interior space and to expand in an exterior space. Singularities or potentials, he calls them, haunt the surface. Thelemites will recognize this as the concept of hadit nuit, hadit being the concept where it contracts into interior space, nuit being the concept of expanding into exterior space. Rahur kuit is the concept of the surface, of things coming into existence at the surface. And the fourth characteristic is similar. He says that the surface is the locus of sense, and he'll go on to elaborate about that. And the fifth characteristic is that the world of sense has a problematic status. So he's again connecting back to the chapter we just talked about in the previous video. So he begins this series talking about the characteristics of sense. He says the two moments of sense, there are two modes. The first one being its impassibility, or its neutrality, or how it doesn't get affected or changed by anything. It doesn't have an inside or an outside. It doesn't have a particular or a generality. The second moment of sense is its genesis. So he refers to that as its neutrality and its productivity. And then he jumps into earlier in the last video, we talked about events with a capital E. That is a series of smaller events can all make up, connect, and become one big event with a capital E. And for his example, he'll use the example of the battle. And talking about how like we can look at the current. In his time, it was the war in Vietnam was the big battle, and so that's the big event, and all the actualities of that war contributed to the event of the Vietnam War. And of course, at the moment I'm making this video, we have this war going on in Ukraine. And it's interesting to me that this comes from the series of the problematic. This is another linking point between the two, because what is one of the biggest problems that humans face is their sort of need to kill each other and blow each other up. And we could say like climate change is another big problem, but the battle, the war, fighting each other gets in the way of trying to solve that problem. And he'll use as examples three writers who wrote about war, which is Stendhal, Victor Hugo, and Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace. But he'll say that the best example, the best literary example, is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, because in that book, the sort of narrator of the whole thing isn't even given a name. And this is one of Deleuze's points, is that these singularities, these events are kind of anonymous. He'll use an example of a mortally wounded soldier, writing that the mortally wounded soldier, the person on the edge of death, participates in the impassibility of the event. So the impassibility of the event, for instance, is that the event, the war in Ukraine, the battle, doesn't care who's winning or losing. It doesn't care who's showing courage or cowardice. It's just the event. It's impassible. And he'll say that the event, and I honestly don't fully understand this, but I'll relate it, is that the event creates the will of anonymity. Using again the example of the soldier on the edge of death, or he calls it a will of indifference. He also calls that a volitional intuition, or a stoic will. So that can be for further contemplation. He ends this section of the battle before getting into his transcendental field part of the chapter by saying, there is a God of war. He is the most impassible, the least permeable to prayers, which is again an interesting way for a philosopher to talk about this, saying there is a God of war. And esoterically, I'll just point out that this is series 15, and 15 is the mystic number of the Sephirah Geburah, and Geburah is where all the gods of war hang out. Okay, until next time.